Hello, everybody. Welcome to Science Sunday. This is the Sunday before the holiday week. The winter solstice is coming up on December 21st. It sometimes wiggles around by a day or two, depending upon how close we are to a leap year. But that would be the shortest daylight of the year. I remember watching Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about misconceptions, common misconceptions. And one of the leading misconceptions is that the days get shorter in winter. Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, sunlight gets shorter in winter, maybe, or there's still sunlight coming. It's just how it hits the globe because of the tilt of the Earth, right?
Yeah, there certainly still will be daylight. But actually, beginning December 21st, the daylight period in a given day will get longer and longer.
Right.
So days actually get longer throughout the winter. So that's something to look forward to. We're coming down to the nadir, to the darkest period of the year, and then there will be more enlightenment to come. Speaking of enlightenment, this program, Science Sunday, is brought to you by the DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church, which is providing the facilities, the AV help. That's where Mike and I met. And I made several great and lifelong friends here. So I appreciate the Unitarian Church being able to host Science Sunday, as they have for many years. Also, thanks go out to the American Humanist Association and our local chapter of Humanists, the Prairie State Humanists. You can find out more about the activities that our Prairie State Humanist group has by looking for us on meetup.com. Just look for Prairie State Humanists. And then I know we have several folks joining us today that are likely from the Chicago Science Field Trip meetup.
Right.
And Science Sunday, I hope, is right up your alley. That's what we do here. We've been doing this, how long has this been going on?
I think we're in our 12th year, maybe it'll be our 13th year of doing it in the next Science Sunday in January.
Wow, your 13th, something like my 11th or
something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been doing this for a long time. It seems like we never run out of things to talk about. The universe continues to be amazing and resplendent with wonders that are accessible to human inquiry. And
worthy of studying, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So today, I want to get down into the weeds with biology and talk about something that comes up every now and then, and that's the notion of the selfish gene. And we've talked a lot about biology over the years here, and it's a fascinating topic. You know, I was trained as a physicist, and my opinion is that physics is just darn simple compared to biology. So
it gets complex in a second, right? You turn your back on a living thing and it mutates.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, biology, is the level of complexity at every level of a biological system, from the ecosystem of the planet to species to individual organisms and cells, and then molecular biology. It's just arbitrarily complicated. So I want to dig into this concept that was popularized about 50 years ago now. Richard Dawkins published a book, I think in 1974, called The Selfish Gene. And it led to some misunderstandings. In subsequent revisions of his book, he has tried to clarify and elucidate his point of view about why he chose the term selfish gene, and we will talk about some of that today. One of the things that people have taken him and his book to task about is that molecules can't express desires. They can't be selfish, they can't be altruistic, they can't be greedy, they can't be, benevolent.
Right, it seems like a title that's meant to be somewhat jarring or get you really thinking like, that can't be.
Yeah.
It's anthropomorphizing a small little gene, and seems seems like it's almost like an editor's choice of a title
Yeah.
more than anything else.
Yeah, and in fact, he has subsequently, in his revisions, talked about alternative names for his book. One of them is, the one I prefer, which he proposed, was the immortal gene. And that gets rid of the dispositional qualities that one might attribute to some biomolecules. And I prefer the immortal gene, but he has a good reason for naming it the selfish gene. By training, he's an ethologist. And that's somebody who studies animal behavior. So he's a biologist. He's probably one of, if not the most famous biologist living in the world today. And he's a fierce proponent of Darwinian evolutionary theory. And he's written many books, just chock full with evidence supporting the Darwinian view of life. Everything from the nearly real-time evolution of microbes that go from subsisting on a diet of sugar to being able to digest more complex sugars or citric acid and things like that in near real time. So he's written all kinds of books explaining evolution. I really recommend his science books. They are some of the clearest books I have ever read, and he has, of course, most of them are about biology, but not all.
And I think he also really pushes at some point that that is a kind of a germane new point that other people haven't looked at it, like thinking about a gene as having a selfish quality.
Right.
May not be exactly correct, but he brings that up in a lot of other books. He's got Climbing Mount Improbable, talking
Right.
about evolution, in which he discusses how evolution actually achieves the things that evolution can. And even though people would think that's so complex, how could
an eye?
Creatures,
Yeah.
how can it happen?
Right. Yeah, that's the famous one is how could the eye possibly evolve? And Mike and I could each answer that for you, but that's not the topic for today. Today's topic is this selfish gene. And Richard Dawkins, I have occasionally throughout this presentation some quotes from him. This is one that I really enjoy and resonates with me. And he says that he says, we are all survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is a truth which still fills me with astonishment.
Quite.
Yes. So he says something like that.
Like that,
Yeah. But it's true, you know, he continued, his astonishment and his insight about looking at the gene's eye view of evolution and evolutionary theory has been particularly elucidating, not just for him, but it has been a prize-winning idea. It's considered one of this book and this idea is considered one of the foundational principles in biology from the past century. So really important idea. And let's talk about why it might be important. Here's another couple of quotes. Another one is, my purpose is to examine the biology of selfishness and altruism. Now, I mentioned that he's an ethologist. So part of the book, The Selfish Gene, goes into some detail, talking about the selfish and the altruistic behaviors of different animal species and populations and whatnot. I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's not really the focus of today's discussion. But that is very interesting to him as a person who specialized in animal behavior. And then he is well aware of some of the criticisms. Even in his first edition of this book, he was well aware of some of the criticisms that would be leveled at this notion. And one of the things that he makes clear many times throughout the book is that he does not promote the idea that all organisms should behave selfishly, right? We don't want a selfish society. We want a society where we can cooperate generously, as he says, and unselfishly towards a common good. But if that's the kind of society we aspire to, and that Richard Dawkins aspires to, it is not the kind of society that we can expect to evolve naturally simply through the blind watchmaker sort of machinations of natural selection. So, he has said in other contexts that essentially nature red in tooth and claw. We cannot and should not, under any circumstances, apply that to human society. Just because he's a Darwinian evolutionist does not mean that everything that can happen in the world should be viewed as optimized when it behaves like a Darwinian system, right? So social Darwinism is right out, right? And he'll admit that readily.
But he's also saying that you're not going to get the social structure that develops a community just by nature developing. It has to, just by evolution, it
Right.
has to be something that comes from the desire of peoples.
Right, and I'm going to talk about that a little more towards the end of today's presentation about, are we a slave to our genetics, as it were. All right, so I want to start about 2 generations before Charles Darwin came up with his idea. I'm going to start with this guy, Lamarck. And Lamarck came up with this interesting notion that animal species do mutate into new forms and new species. And you may have heard this story of the giraffe. He believed that there were, or he hypothesized that there may have been sort of horse-like creatures who kept reaching for ever taller branches to eat leaves off of. And over generations of different animals stretching their necks out, well, they may have plausibly, according to him, given birth to offspring whose necks were pre-stretched. And given enough time, this stretching and then the inheritance of this stretching would give rise, would transition, as it were, from a horse to a giraffe.
Although it's interesting, Lamarck was actually one of the first to really see the scientific benefits of looking at evolution. He
Right.
was one, he was searching and hunting for reasons.
Right. So he was taking, what today we might call baby steps, or the first tentative steps towards a naturalistic explanation of the origin of species.
Right.
So, it's easy to denigrate people who have ideas that turned out not to be correct or not to be wholly correct. But the nugget of the idea that species could mutate into new species, that was really controversial during his time. Mm-hmm. And he died in 1929, which was just a couple years before Darwin set out on the Beagle.
Lamarck did.
1829. What did I say, 19?
Yeah,
1829, sorry. Thank you for
That's why I'm
keeping
here.
me honest there. Yeah. So,
His name doesn't have that first R in it either.
Lamarck? Oh, yeah, I have a typo. Sorry about that. Thanks for catching that. Yeah, it's Lamarck, not
You're going to
Lamarck.
put it in Wikipedia or something.
Yeah.
No R there after that.
So everything I say from here on out should be reasonably called into question because I have spelling errors, which is just...
We take that for granted, though. That's
Oh, gee, thanks. Yeah, all right. So then Darwin comes along, and he has this idea of this branching sort of tree of life. This is a famous diagram from his manuscript. Was this in the manuscript for The Origin of Species, or was this a note he made on the Beagle? Do you remember?
So, notes. One of his notes had that, and this is, he said, "I think," and you can see that at the top. I think.
Yeah.
And this is his first kind of tree of life kind of explanation.
Yeah.
Just doodling to try to understand it.
And it turned out to be a remarkably fecund idea, right? It had a lot of consequences, just this simple notion of one or a few species evolving into new species over time. And, one of the nicest depictions of this that I remember is from the original series Cosmos. And this is a little video clip showing, as Carl Sagan talked about the ideas of natural selection and evolution, a little video clip showing how species branch over time, and some of the branches evolve into newer species, ultimately ending up with the species we see around us today, including humans. But evolution is not goal-directed. It's not, there's no, talking about anthropomorphism, there's no driving anthropomorphic kind of incentive to get from one place to another in terms of complexity or capability. It's just this continuous cycle of evolving characteristics that are compatible with one's environment. And that environment includes other living things that are wanting to eat you or compete with you. All right. Next, I want to emphasize, Mike, you already brought this up, but I want to emphasize that both Lamarck and Charles Darwin had the notion of inheritance, that inheritance played a critical role in what we today would call evolution. Now, evolution, in order to occur, requires some level of change. Now, I will characterize it as constant change, but constant here is over the period of nearly geologic time, right? Every human being has acquired a certain number, statistically speaking, a certain number of mutations, just because of cosmic rays and errors in copying, our internal genomes and whatnot. Each of us contains a few genetic mutations. And the question is, natural selection needs variation in order to operate. There needs to be a slight difference among living things. The question is, at what level does selection operate? Now, the biggest level you can think of is the group level. You can think about whole populations that change. Maybe a population of elephants goes from being gray to whiter in color. Maybe because of different exposure to sunlight levels. Maybe their tusks change, or maybe their ears change. And you think about the whole group changing. You can also think about, I think we've talked about this in the past, maybe you've delved into it a little more deeply, the cichlids in the lakes, freshwater lakes in Africa, how there are many different species of cichlids. And why would there be many species, and yet they all exhibit some common characteristics to indicate that they had a common lineage? So one can plausibly think about natural selection happening at the group level, giving rise to whole groups of new species. But that is kind of problematic, right? One of the things that group selection entails is this notion that members of the group would be willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the group. That's just a logical consequence of having the group, the wellness of the group, be a primary motivator or a primary sieve or filter with natural selection. If the good of the group was more important than anything else, you'd expect groups to be liberally populated with individuals that will self-sacrifice for the good of the group. But all it would take, and Richard goes into some detail about this in his book, all it would take would be for a few cheaters, right, who aren't willing to sacrifice themselves and want to stay under the covers or behind the bush or deep in the cave when danger presents itself, while everybody else is rushing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the group. These selfish individuals would be more likely to survive. And over time, you can actually mathematically model this kind of behavior. Over time, the selfish individuals are the ones that are more likely to preserve the species.
There's some counter arguments to that as well, too, right? In terms of maybe a lot of times conflict, if you're thinking in a hominid society where you have conflicting people and the cowards stay away from the fight and the brave warriors go out and fight and they're more likely to die, and then you'd say that they're not passing on their genes. But in many of those arguments, many of those fights were more like, I don't know, pushing matches or something like that.
Yeah, non-lethal. And you see that
Non-lethal, right.
today in a lot of, speaking of animal behavior, ethology, you see that in a lot of animals, animals where the males
Not a
compete for
mortal
females.
combat.
Right, it's rarely a mortal combat.
Right. And so then there's more privilege or more esteem may be given to the ones that come back who have fought.
Yeah.
They have their pick of mates and things like that.
Yeah, it's a social status, and
Right.
social developments necessarily entail a group. You know, you can't have a social relationship with one individual or as one individual, right? So there is a level of natural selection that operates to select for behaviors in a social context. There certainly is that. But the element that is mutated by natural selection is whatever it is that's driving the behavior. And that may be, for example, well, let me finish this thought and I'll get back to that. Again, what is a group? Is it the local tribe or herd? Is it a particular herd of elephants or pronghorn or a particular school of fish? Or is it a species? Is that what the good of the group means? Does it mean the whole species? You do something, you would travel far and expend great resources to help your species, irregardless. That's not a word, is it? Regardless of their clump size. Or maybe it's a class, maybe a mammalia, right? I mean, think about lions that eat antelope. They're both mammals, so if the idea is to preserve as much of the uniqueness of mammals as possible, then maybe leopards and lions and whatnot should eat fish or birds instead of other mammals, because mammals are more closely related to the lion, to the predator. Other mammals are more closely related to that predator than is another phylum or class, right? It's a very distant relationship that could be drawn between a lion and a fish. Maybe it's just vertebrates in general. Maybe if you really want to preserve the uniqueness, maybe you should get as far away from anything that's uniquely you as possible. And so maybe as a vertebrate, maybe we should eat invertebrates. Maybe we should be driven by natural selection forces. I use forces in quotes, air quotes, by the machinations of natural selection to preferentially feed on invertebrates.
You're just posing different possibilities, right?
Right.
I'm rebelling at some of them, but
Yeah, are you?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like you're going to eat something that's available. You're going to chase something that's available and closer. You wouldn't imagine that a lion would run past or wander past herds of antelope to go to the water hole and try to splash out fish or something like that.
But you could imagine a context in which what we know of today as a lion would have evolved characteristics that enabled it to be a better fisher rather than a better antelope catcher. If natural selection were trying to preserve the uniqueness of mammals compared to fish, because any given mammal is more closely related to any other given mammal than any mammal is to a fish. So if the idea was that uniqueness and relatedness are important, whether it's at the group level, the herd level, the species, etc., if uniqueness and relatedness is the important thing that natural selection filters on, then you'd expect organisms that are more distantly related to be more in competition.
Right, but I don't see that happening.
Right, and
That's the point
that
there,
was
right?
Dawkins' point.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that it leads to this conclusion of absurdity, right? Which you sniffed out, right? You figured out that this was absurd. And it is absurd, right? Natural selection doesn't operate at the group level. And biologists today completely reject this hypothesis. But maybe it happens instead at the organism level, right? Maybe one of the examples that Dawkins talks about in his book is stick bugs that reproduce asexually. And maybe you've got a stick bug who loses a limb in a fight with a predator or some accident.
Another stick bug, maybe.
Right, but when that stick bug reproduces, it does not produce a stick bug with a missing limb, right? I mean, this is the kind of reasoning that Lamarck might have been in favor of, is that any change to your body that happens during your life has a plausibility of being passed along to your offspring. You know, here we see a butterfly with a torn wing, but the butterfly is seeming to be thriving in a certain sense. It's still feeding. It looks like it's recently arrived at this flower. And so, you know, Lamarck would say an acquired characteristic of a body would be replicated in its descendants. And this is a good time to highlight the difference between a reproducer and a replicator. So, especially when talking about sexual reproduction, we and most animals and many plants, most plants perhaps, are capable and engage in reproductive behavior, but our children don't look identical to us. And no species has children that have identical characteristics to the parents unless they reproduce asexually. But even in those cases where asexual reproduction happens, acquired characteristics of the organism, of the individual, are not passed on. So that is not the unit of selection.
You're skipping over epigenetics here a bit, but...
Yes.
Okay.
I'll get back to epigenetics later on in the talk.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there is some small group of environmentally localized changes to an organism that can be passed on. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So maybe the cell is the unit of replication. When a cell divides, one might plausibly ask if it makes an identical copy. Is replication of a cell identical to the reproduction of a cell? Well, it turns out the answer to that is no, because if you think about the way any embryo develops, cells that may have, as we now know, the same genetic code end up being very different kinds of cells. You can have a liver cell, a brain cell, a little toe cell, etc. And the cells are not identical copies of one another because of the way that they metabolize and behave in terms of their molecular biology, whether or not they have actin and myosin fibers that interlock as a muscle cell, or whether they have channels for ions like a neural cell, etc. So, most of you, I assume, know the punchline already, that the unit of selection for natural selection is DNA or genetics. Those are the things that provide the programming for the structure and the behavior of the bodies that carry the DNA around. And Richard Dawkins was bold enough to call these bodies of ours, or the body of a plant or an animal, he called them survival machines. So his point of view is that these immortal coils, here you see, I think this happens to be a virus particle with the coiled DNA in it, but the immortal coils of DNA that pass from generation to generation. And unlike a body that is changed by losing a limb or stretching its neck, etc., if any change happens to those coils of DNA, the DNA is what is replicated. It's not reproduced, it's replicated one for one with occasional copying errors. So the DNA that is mixed, some from your father and some from your mother to make a unique egg or a unique sperm cell, it's that particular mixture of pieces of DNA from their respective parents mixed in to your generation. It's the DNA that is copied with great fidelity. And if there's a mutation to the DNA along the way, that mutation is copied. So
And the only time it's not replicated is when there's sexual congress and you get half of the DNA from
right.
a mother and half the DNA from a father, and then this whole starts off anew, and then this replication stays germane, stays
right.
true. Right.
Yeah, so the unit that is replicated with fidelity across time and across generations is the genetic information, not the somatic information about your body, not the phenotype It's the genotype. The phenotype is your body. It's the, it's the structure of a tree, the structure of a catfish, etc. The phenotype is the body that is the outcome of the recipe, of the genetic recipe. But the phenotype is not what is replicated. It's the instructions. It's the recipe that's replicated. And it's the instructions that must change if a phenotype will subsequently change its capacities and capabilities.
And I think this is where Dawkins kind of takes off from this point, right, in his selfish gene thing. I mean, there's no debate about body structures change or different things happen. If you have an arm lopped off, you don't pass it on, and all those different things. And everyone of knowledge in the biological field knows that the information carrying device is the gene, is the DNA.
Right.
So he's developing this point, and now he's going to expand on it.
Right.
Yeah.
But in the 1970s, this point, I mentioned in a couple slides previously some of the scientific giants upon whose shoulders he metaphorically stood. This was not a brand new idea to Dawkins, but Dawkins recognized that this idea that he had learned from others was really important and helped him understand many things about the way plants and animals, we might say, behave, right? Again, the ethologist in him tried to understand the roots of selfish or altruistic behavior, and he recognized that all of those must be literally genetically programmed. So we're familiar with DNA. I think we've talked about the structure of DNA in several different Science Sundays, the nucleotides, the paired bases and whatnot, and I'm not going to belabor that today. But they end up in chromosomes. Now, this picture happens to show just several X chromosomes, but you have 23 pair of chromosomes in a human body, only one of which is an X chromosome. If you have two X's, you end up being a female. If you have an X and a Y, you end up being a male. But there are 21 other chromosomes besides the X and the Y, or 22 others. And all of those chromosomes contain coiled DNA. And if you were to uncoil the DNA in the instructions in every one of your cells, it would reach back and forth to the sun something like 10 times. It's a huge amount of, it's linear information. A, G, T, C, et cetera, et cetera. It's linear information. If you were to string all of that out from every copy in every one of your cells, it would be enormously huge amount of information.
Yeah, this picture somewhat misinterprets that. It's so packed in there that it doesn't, if you blow up a chromosome to that size, that's not what you'd see inside it. It would be
about 6 foot. It's about 6 feet of genetic material is inside
each chromosome.
Right.
When there's 23 pairs in each of our cells.
Right. And then the pairs operate, you've got recessive and dominant genes and whatnot. Again, not specifically a talk about how genetics works, but it's a very complicated piece of biomachinery, molecular machinery. And what Dawkins and others, but what he made particularly famous, is this idea that genes are immortal. You could have a gene that evolved to in such a way that it facilitated a particular metabolic pathway in an ancient bacteria. And then as we run the clock forward in time, direct descendants of those bacteria may still be around as bacteria. But at some point, some of the daughter cells from that cyanobacteria split off and split off again and gave rise to potentially additional species over time. So you've got this same copy of this same genetic material in something quite different, say a worm. And this same snippet of the genetic code shows up again potentially in a fish. And then in a dinosaur. And then today, that same snippet of genetic material exists in human beings. So this instruction, not the particular molecule, but the specific arrangement of the molecules as a carrier of information, has persisted for literally billions of years across time with very little, and in some cases, no change whatsoever. So it is entirely appropriate to talk about an immortal piece of DNA, which Richard Dawkins has deemed gene. And we'll talk a little bit about, we talked earlier about the problem with calling it selfish, and in a little while I'm going to highlight the problems with calling this a gene. Now, how is it that something like a bacterium can create more genetic diversity, more raw material for the genetic programming to operate? More lines in the recipe, as it were. Well, chromosomes are not infrequently doubled up accidentally. And usually the carriers of an additional copy of a particular chromosome, usually it's benign. Sometimes it can be quite damaging to one's health, especially on the sex-determining cells. If you end up with extra copies of Ys and X's, it can be problematic. And certainly Down syndrome is another extra copy of a chromosome. But you can have genes that migrate, pieces of DNA that migrate from one chromosome to another. You can have pieces of genetic code that duplicate within a chromosome. You can also have pieces of genetic code that flip head to tail in a copy in the same or a different chromosome. So there's many ways for the information encoded in a chromosome to be rearranged and shuffled in random events that don't have to do specifically with sexual reproduction or the random selecting of pieces of your parents' genomes that go into the gamete cells. Another thing that can happen, as I mentioned, is that whole chromosomes are copied. And then you may also have what you may be more familiar with, SNP, single nucleotide polymorphisms, where a particular copy of a particular sequence of genetic recipe, one nucleotide, one A, G, T, or C within that is mutated or changed into a different one. So there's many ways for the information in a genome to get shuffled around aside from sexual selection. And each of these provides an opportunity for a copy of a particular set of code, snippet of code, if you will, for that copy to start acquiring additional expressions for the phenotype. It could be a different instinctual behavior that it leads to. It could be a different body structure or length of a limb, etc. So the variability that's introduced into the genetic code has many ways to occur. And it's not just because of mixing up of pre-existing genes that happen during the union of gamete cells in sexual reproduction. Any questions or whatnot so far, Mike?
Well, John Farmer just mentioned, what about genes that get modified or damaged by external chemicals or radiation? Can the change be passed on as a variation? And we all know that that's true. Anything that changes the gamete,
yeah, if it's a
DNA,
sperm or an egg cell that gets changed,
right,
sure.
Right. If it passes on, if it changes something in there, but if you have skin cancer on your arm or something like that, that doesn't mean you're going to pass that on to
Right.
an offspring after that.
Exactly.
So earlier on, I think James Walter said he had some problems with selfish gene arguments. One, in sexual selection, reproduction, half of all genes die, and he considers this a fatal problem for Dawkins. These deaths of genes shows that selfish genes is wrong. Shiloh took him on a little bit here.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah, so it's the information packet that persists. Even if an individual gamete cell, an individual sperm or egg cell, never has an opportunity to form a zygote, a developing organism, the information in a random gamete cell is likely to be present in many, many others as well. So it's the code, it's the recipe that persists, not the individual sperm or the individual egg or even the individual fertilized egg. Right? It's the information that is passed on. It's the information that is carried from one generation to another. And
I thought I was kind of getting at it when I said that there has to be a way to mix up the genetic structure that's of evolutionary benefit.
Right.
So just because that occurs at one point, then after that, if things go along with a
right.
with a non-sexual growth of individuals of any species,
Well,
that's when the selfish gene aspect takes place.
right, and to James' point, it's not that the particular cell, the particular egg cell or sperm cell or even a fertilized egg or any cell in an individual, that cell is not the selfish entity. Remember back to that Russian doll picture, the cell, I might have glossed over it a little, but the cell is not the unit of natural selection. Cells come and go. Your body reforms itself on average about every 7 years. You're made out of, if I remember correctly, out of new cells compared to you of 7 years ago. So the cell is not the thing that is ascribed selfishness or immortality, right? I prefer the term immortality in many contexts. It's the piece of information that is immortal.
And I think Dawkins is saying too that goes on beyond the life of the individual. Right?
Absolutely.
That's the
Yeah.
key to this whole thing, that it doesn't just
Right.
live and die with the death and birth of a new individual.
Right, the prior slide where I had that little snippet of genetic code marching forward in time, you definitely have, in fact, it may be the next slide, where the amount of genetic material that you share with other living things on the planet is extraordinary. Human beings do not have a completely unique genetic code.
Like 98.8% of our genetic code is the same as chimpanzees.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're the same creatures by any sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right?
But there's similarity.
Yeah, these numbers come from a particular source. There may be a little bit of fiddling with some of the significant digits on them, but in general, this idea holds true that 70% of the genes that are in each one of your cells is also in a zebrafish or a slug, thereabouts. You share about 50% of your genetic material with a banana. So,
Get over yourself, right?
well, yeah. I don't care how appealing you are.
A little yellow there. Yellow
Yep,
humor.
yep. But the idea is, think about the gene's eye view. Go ahead for just a half a second and anthropomorphize whatever gene made it all the way from a yeast cell to a daffodil to an apple and a honeybee and a cat and an orangutan and a human being. That was one successful gene. It's the gene, it's the information encoded in the DNA that's passed from generation to generation. And the information, insofar as it helps the survival, it helps program and build a survival machine that's good at reproducing, then that gene will also be successful.
And a banana is a valid survival machine, and a chimp is a valid survival
Right.
machine, and a human, they all
And a
are
cockroach,
valid.
yeah, they're all, right. Yeah. And in many respects, genetic information is shared between all of these things. And to emphasize it again, we are our genes' survival machines. Now, one of the things that Richard talks about in his book, The Selfish Gene, is that he could have as easily named his book The Cooperative Gene. He said it's absolutely valid to think of survival machines as different organisms and species as cooperative agglomerations or assemblages of gene colonies that work and play well together. And in that sense, they're cooperative, they're altruistic, So these genes work and play well with others. So again, he chose deliberately to talk about selfishness, and I think it has misled a lot of people to thinking that genes are anthropomorphic or the genetic code is anthropomorphic. It's just doing its dumb replication thing, and whatever replicators are more successful, those are the ones that will persist, even through transitions into being carried along through time in completely new species. Now, I want to talk in the remaining minutes about this idea of the central dogma of biology. Some of you, and I know I am, old enough to remember being taught in school that DNA contains a lot of junk, and then there are genes. And the way that biology works is each gene in your bundled up DNA encodes for one bit of messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA goes out into the body of the cell and finds a ribosome that transcribes that messenger RNA into a protein. And so you can draw a one-to-one correlation between the proteins that build your body and carry out your metabolic processes. There's a one-to-one correlation between each protein that you manifest, or that a bullfrog manifests, etc., and a particular protein. So there's one gene, one protein, another gene, another protein, etc. And humans have 20,000 distinct genes that have been identified. I think a tomato has something like 200,000, something like that. So that's an interesting thing. Talk about humbling. But yet, how much more capable of thriving and adapting are humans compared to tomatoes? So the genetic code is not the be-all and end-all. There were hints of that long ago. But the central dogma idea is wrong in so many ways, right? A stretch of DNA can have pieces of it that are incorporated into the code for more than one protein, for example. Or you can have widely separated pieces that both go into the same protein. It's a complicated thing. And then the other thing that is really interesting is that the geometry of the way DNA folds within a given nucleus of a cell, the geometry turns out to be really important. It's not just a coiled spring that sits there inert and inactive. The DNA inside every living cell is a dynamic, I'm tempted to say organism. It's a dynamic, thriving, energetic, chemical
Conglomeration.
Yeah, there you go, conglomeration. I just, the anthropomorphic language is so tempting, right? And depending upon whether it's a loop or a fold or a protrusion in a particular cell, depending on how the DNA folds in a particular cell, controls which genes are expressed, which proteins are manufactured by that particular cell. It's enormously complicated. And it's complicated further by the notion, Mike, you mentioned earlier, epigenetics. You see these little green things, those are like little spindles that DNA coils around. And there are other bits of machinery in the nucleus of a cell, typically RNA-based. So one piece of the DNA can encode for a little piece of RNA that then goes off inside the nucleus and coils or uncoils something around one of these spindles. And once it's coiled up around a spindle, it's essentially inaccessible for expression. Incredibly complicated. And then the little yellow beads on some of the DNA, those are, I think, histone groups, methyl groups. So you can methylize bits of the DNA and keep them from expressing themselves. So the level of expression, the amount of activity in your cellular factories when it comes to copying or even expressing the amount of protein from a particular gene, that's all encoded in the DNA. And some of that, they've recently found, can be transmitted up to a couple of generations forward in time. So epigenetic changes about your level of stress in your environment, whether you smoke or not, and some of the reactions of a body to inhaling smoke, all kinds of things can lead to epigenetic effects that are preserved across at least one, possibly two generations subsequently. And that has to do with the way that different genetic material and the code in the recipe, the level to which it's expressed. Instead of one egg and a cup of flour, maybe it's 2 eggs and a cup of flour, right? It's the information about how much of this to make.
Yeah, there are some amazing studies of that I can't remember completely, but there was some level of a capacity in an organism to notice or being trained to notice that there was a rose-colored feature, rose-colored smell or taint to some solution.
Okay.
And that could pass on, and it reacted in a way to it. And I think there was maybe
So a
another
simple
stimulus
organism.
given.
Yeah.
Simple organism given a rose-colored infusion of water, let's say, and then a stimulus was given, and it did certain things, and somehow that could be passed on to succeeding generations, that the succeeding generations that normally wouldn't react in a certain way did,
Right.
because it passed on this epigenetic folding or a histone created or a methyl piece created that stopped.
That preserved a kind of memory of its environment.
Right.
Yeah, for the subsequent generation.
Right.
But it tends to be, everything I've read, it's a very short-lived effect in terms of generations, right? It's not a natural selection, long-term kind of effect. It's more of a, hey, you better be ready because it's, it's hell out here kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
Or rose-scented.
Or it's rosy.
Right. So again, holes in this central dogma, and Dawkins wrote his book originally when the central dogma was ascendant, and it has since really been torn apart. And this idea that RNA, its job is to copy bits of DNA and then go outside of the nucleus and encode for proteins, simplifying a little bit. But there are bits of RNA that are created from templates stored in your DNA, and these pieces of RNA have functional roles in the cell, not just protein encoding roles. So there's these things called non-coding RNA. Non-coding RNA is, for example, in every ribosome. Every cell you have in your body, I think, every cell in your body has ribosomes that manufacture proteins. And you can have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these ribosome factories in a given cell. And they read the messenger RNA, et cetera, et cetera. But these little factories for protein, the ribosome itself is constructed largely of RNA. And the way they get built is by reading RNA off of templates from the DNA, and then that goes off and immediately forms a ribosome machine. It doesn't get translated into anything. And so there's more and more discoveries over time about non-coding RNA. There's long non-coding RNA, a recent discovery in the past 10 or 15 years. And some of the function of some of these very longer than 200 base pairs, I think, of RNA that has some function in the cell. And there's untranslated regions of DNA, which may go back into the folding, right? The particular shape that DNA is able to manifest in different contexts. Sometimes just having extra space to form the geometry needed can be important. And then there literally is some junk RNA, or I'm sorry, junk DNA left over from prior viral infections and whatnot, and genes that are no longer expressed. But even that, I think, could be relevant to the particular geometric folding in a particular organism. So getting rid of it could be problematic. And then there's regulatory DNA that controls, like we said, the expression level, how much of a given metabolic process happens in a given cell. And then I already mentioned the ribosomal RNA. So all of this, every bullet point in this list, is counter to the simplistic central dogma of molecular genetics that was around at the time Dawkins first wrote his book.
and you and I were maybe going to school, and most people listening to this.
Right.
So there's been amazing developments and understandings, or understanding what we don't understand, or
Right.
understanding that we don't understand.
But Dawkins escapes unscathed. He had a very slippery ploy, and that is he has his own definition of a gene. So when he talks about the selfish gene, he's not talking about the one-for-one, one gene to one protein kind of gene. He defines his own gene. And he says that a gene is defined as any portion of a chromosomal material that potentially lasts for enough generations to serve as a unit of natural selection. A gene is a replicator with high copying fidelity.
You do that well. I've heard him speak, and he could be standing here for.
Thank you.
That was well done.
Yeah, so according to this more relaxed definition of a gene, it's any snippet of a chromosome or a strand of DNA that happens to undergo high-quality replication across generations. And so whether that's a ribosomal, the code for making a ribosomal RNA, or whether it's the code for making a long non-coding RNA, et cetera, any snippet of the genetic code that is copied with fidelity across the generations is immediately susceptible to natural selection, because any change in that snippet of DNA will cause a change in its product, whether that product is a protein or a ribosome or the controller for the number of fingers you have, etc., any kind of instruction.
Or no instruction at all.
Oh, right, just garbage. But sometimes nature and natural selection goes down a path such that some bit of code in the recipe that was once garbage is now repurposed to do something that helps with survival. Replicators are not conscious or purposeful, therefore they can't be selfish. And he, many times in his book, says, something like, anybody who thinks that I mean they are literally selfish, running around trying to do what's best for them with some goal in mind, is, bonkers. He clearly does not mean it, and he clearly says many times that that's not what he means. But it's a useful metaphor. I think the metaphor has been liable to cause more confusion than if he had said immortal gene.
Although sometimes people intentionally
Rabble-rousers.
misinterpret it, right?
Yeah.
For their own purposes, to belittle a concept or an idea.
Right. So you can read this, the same old process of selection between rival molecules by reason of their longevity, fecundity, and copying fidelity. It's the same thing that happened to the first replicating molecules, and it's the same thing that happens at the level of complex organisms today. Another quote, to be strict, this book, I really loved this one when I came across it. To be strict, this book should not be called the selfish cistron, that's another name for a gene in the classical sense, nor the selfish chromosome, but the slightly selfish big bit of chromosome and the even more selfish little bit of chromosome. He thought that would have been a good title, with the notion that the smaller the unit of DNA that you're investigating, the more likely that tiny unit is to be preserved through subsequent generations. As you get longer and longer, the chance of a copying error or a duplication or an omission or a reversal becomes greater. All right, I want to finish up with this amazing animation that I found on YouTube. This is a fellow who created a program, and he has different behaviors that his little agent entities that live nowhere except in a computer live, again, as anthropomorphic. These entities are programmed in a computer, and it's a population of them, and they all have very similar programming. Move left, move right, go up, go down, etc. Emit a bit of pheromone or not. And what he did was he programmed random genetic change in the behavior instructions of these simulated agents running in a computer program. and I want you to see what happens. So there will be audio associated with this video. I don't know if you need to make sure that's enabled. And these are some of the possible action outputs that derive from another set of instructions that prescribe how these actions are manifest from one generation to another.
Dawkins was a very capable computer programmer.
Oh yeah, he's done great.
Big strength
Yep.
in his early days and so on. And he had, I don't know if it was in relation to this book, but he had like evolutionary sequences planned on computers where randomly things could generate from a small
Right.
spot and so on.
Yeah, I've got a book of his. I can't remember the title of it, but it's essentially builds geometric structures
Right.
that look kind of like
mollusks
viruses,
and
right? Yeah.
like butterflies and different things like that. And he shows this random generation of mutations causes things that look very similar to what we see in the world nowadays.
Right. So here, let's see this bit of just astonishing, nearly magical behavior just from a bit of computer code, which is much smaller than a genetic code.
So let's do our next simulation run, and this is the one that shows how mutations work. First of all, let's set up a run where our parameters are similar to the last time. We have 128 by 128 grid points in the world, that's the size. But the population now is bigger. This time we'll have a population of 3,000. Again, we'll have 300 simulator steps in each generation. They'll last 10 seconds in each generation. This time we'll give them bigger brains. Their genomes will be 24 genes long, which means 24 brain connections, which means that they'll be a little smarter. They'll be allowed to use up to 4 internal neurons, so they'll be capable of slightly smarter behavior. In this particular run, our survival criterion will be similar to the last time, except this time there's a narrow margin on the right and a narrow margin on the left where they can reproduce. Those are the spawning areas. If they end up in those areas, they will reproduce. There's enough space in both of these spawning areas put together to allow the entire population of 3,000 to fit inside and to reproduce if they can just evolve a way to do that. So let's see what happens. Here's our starting population randomly distributed. This is generation 0. We let them run and they, as usual, generation 0 just looks random. At the end, by random chance, 27% of the population happened to be in the spawning areas and they reproduced. Let's skip forward to generation 25. In this generation, some of them have learned to move east, and now the survival rate has gone up from 27% to 56%. Let's go forward to generation 100. In generation 100, they're getting a little smarter. Now 67%, up from 56%. Now 67% have found their way to the spawning areas and are reproducing. Let's go forward 600 more generations to generation 700. In generation 700, a mutation happened that caused some of them to start going west instead of east, and now 82% of them are surviving in each generation and reproducing. That's a good increase. Let's go forward 300 more generations to generation 1000. Now they're more evenly divided, going east and west, and now we have a survival rate that has gone up from 82% to 98.5%. Now let's go forward several thousand generations to generation 8300 and take a look. 99.3% of the individuals in generation 8300 make it to the spawning areas. The only ones who don't are those who just were unlucky with mutations and they don't have the right brain wiring to know how to make it to the spawning area. There's very low genetic diversity, as you can see by the uniform color. Most have a very similar set of genes. They've done a really good job of evolving a solution to their environment. They know how to survive. They know how to reproduce. But now, let's upset their nice, peaceful little world. We will introduce these barriers, these 5 barriers that block their movement east and west, and let's see what happens. The very next generation after putting in these barriers, a lot of them get blocked on the barriers. The survival rate plummets to just 69%. From almost everyone surviving, Now almost a third of them are getting hung up on these barriers and not making it to the spawning area. So what's going to happen now? This is the miracle of mutations. Because of occasional mutations, even though everyone has nearly the same genes, once in a while a child will be born that escapes being blocked by some method, and they will have children. Those that get blocked don't reproduce. But if one child makes it around the blockage and reproduces, the next generation will have more of those genes. So here's what happens. After just 700 more generations, by generation 9,000, many of them have started to move north or south in addition to just moving east or west. They take a different route, they get around the barriers, and the survival rate now has gone up from 69% back up to 73%. They are starting to learn how to adapt to the new environment. I let this particular simulation run for 177,000 generations. They never quite got back to 100% survival rate like they had without the barriers, but they finally stabilized at around an 83% survival rate. You can see how they go different directions, not just east or west. They've learned how to get around the barriers pretty well. Now, this adaptation worked because of mutations and natural selection. There's nothing in their programming that enabled them explicitly to figure this out. It's just that when a mutation happened that allowed a child to survive, it reproduced. Now, let's do the same run again, but this time let's set the mutation rate to be 0. No mutations will happen, and let's see what the difference is. The first generation, of course, looks the same. They appear all random. There's no difference there. By generation 100, 97% of them are finding the spawning areas, and they're reproducing. By generation 8,000, the genetic diversity is very small, just like the last run, and 98% are reproducing. This is very similar to the last run. Now let's introduce the barriers. We introduce the barriers, and the survival rate immediately plummets to 66%. This is similar to what happened in the last run. But here's the difference. There's no mutations going on now, and everyone in the population has just about the same genes. The gene pool is very homogeneous. There's not a lot of diversity there to draw on. The children inherit the same genes over and over and over, generation after generation. There's no change in those genes, no improvement in their behavior. We can let this colony run for millions of generations, and they will never, ever get any better than this. That's the value of mutation. Mutations need to occur often enough in a population to let the population adapt to changes in the environment, but not too much of mutation so that the colony doesn't have to spend all of its time taking care of members with mutations. So there's some optimal rate of mutations that allows a species to continually, over time, very slowly, step by step, adapt to its changing environment. After seeing the effect of mutation in this simulation, I've personally have just a little bit more respect for the role of mutation in the survival of a species. Without mutations in our species, we would not be here having this discussion. Without mutations, our species would not live long enough in the future to survive and eventually reach the stars.
So, I know I went a little bit over today, but I want to reemphasize that all of that mutation in behavior was because of changes in the genome, as it were, programmed into these virtual creatures, these computer simulated creatures. And the last point I'll make is that one of the great innovations of natural selection is a brain. So no longer are all of our behaviors stipulated in advance by natural selection through programmed instincts in our genome. But by having brains, every creature, from humans to goldfish, has the ability, to a greater or lesser extent, to deliberately learn and change its behavior. So brains are one of the greatest inventions of natural selection and allows us to get beyond locked-in behavior relative to our genome. Thank you all for watching. We'll be back on the, is it the 19th? What?
It's right around there, yeah, I forget right now.
Keep an eye out on
14th, 16th and the 30th, right?
something like, yeah. Keep an eye out. We'll be back in the middle of January with another Science Sunday.
Right.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Goodbye.